Work complete. Zug. Ready to work. Loktar. Ready to work. Ready to work. Zug. Work complete. Zug. Loktar. Ready to work. Zug. Work complete. Zug. Ready to work. Loktar. Work complete. Zug. Loktar. Ready to work. Work complete. Work complete. Loktar. We're being attacked. Ready to work. Zug. Ready to work. Loktar. Ready to work. Loktar. Ready? Yes, Master. Alright. Yes, Master. Alright, yes, Master. Okay. Yes, Master. Okay. Yes, Master. Okay. We're being attacked. Okay. Work complete. Yes, Master. Alright, okay. 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 Yes, Master. Alright. Okay. Make it
Very Very well. Very well. Of course. Very well. Make it quick. Make it quick. Yes. Of course. Very well. Very well. Very well. Of course. Very well. Very well.